Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast. Of course, I am Adam Lowther, as always. And today we have with us a good friend and one of what I think personally, he's one of the smartest and most thoughtful people in the space world. That, of course, is Chris Stone. And Chris is a senior fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where he does the space work for NIDS. And Chris, you welcome to NucleCast.
Thank you.
Now, you had an op-ed recently. There was a really interesting op-ed, and it was provocative, and I agreed with you. You made a compelling argument, and I want you to walk us through, the issue at hand, and then the argument that you made, and then I think it opens up to a wider discussion. But I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. So a couple weeks ago now, I published an editorial in Defense News regarding who will defend the commercial sector, if not the Space Force. And by Space Force, that includes U.S. Space Command, which we'll get to the differences between the two in a little bit. But the reason why I wrote that is because the week prior or so, there was an article that came out, several actually, quoting both Chief of Space Operations and the Commander of U.S. Space Command, two different people. One's in charge of the service, one's in charge of the Combatant Command. And the Combatant Commander, General Dickinson, Army General, basically was quoted as saying that to the commercial space operators out there, that essentially we don't have any orders to protect you from attacks, that essentially you're on your own. Now I'm paraphrasing, that wasn't his exact words, but that's essentially what he was saying. And so I thought that was odd coming from him. And then there was a similar type of comment from General Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations. And so I thought it was odd that they would say that, and and the reason why is because even before Space Force was established and Space Command were established in 2019, there have been many hearings in Congress where commercial sector leaders, CEOs of companies, things of that sort, have testified, and they were asked, do you think that this is a good idea to have a service for organizing and training and equipping space forces to address the threat of China and other threats in space, and having a combatant command to actually engage in the operations in space from a combatant command type of role? And pretty much all of them said, yeah, we need protection from threats just as much as the government vehicles do, because as many of your listeners may be aware, from the terrestrial support side, about 70-80% of all communications, satellite communications, is provided by the commercial sector to the military. And as the commercial sector widens their capabilities from launch and everything else, that the commercial sector is only becoming more important as a support function to the various services and agencies that conduct our national defense and our imagery intelligence. So hearing that from the combatant commander was a little weird. And what he was saying by extension of that is essentially that my boss and my boss's boss, meaning the president and the secretary of defense, haven't given me that direction. And I thought that was strange. And so I did some homework and I looked into what's called the Unified Command Plan, which is the document that comes from the White House that gives the marching orders, if you will, to each of the combatant commanders. Space Command being obviously one of them. And initially, when Space Command was created in 2019, their objective was to protect and defend, deter, and things of that sort in the space environment. And the key area of responsibility for Space Command was 100 kilometers and up. That was a quote at the time. Well, looking at, apparently there's been a change to that in 2022 or so that changed it to where terrestrial support of combatants is primary mission, and secondary mission is protect and defend and space superiority and all that. Add to that the vice commander of Space Command basically saying that the same thing. Our mission is primarily support and things of that sort. And so I wrote using a recent example from a naval example of where merchant vessels in the Sea of Oman were attacked by Iranian naval vessels, and a U.S. destroyer responded to push them away and to keep the sea lanes open. And I use that as an analogy for what Space Force and the U.S. Space Command are supposed to be doing for space, that their primary mission, the reason why they have an area of responsibility in space, is to focus on the space threat. And the supporting role, while important, really should be its secondary mission. And so that's kind of it in a nutshell. If you have any more questions, we can dig into it deeper.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the AMLA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Well, I'm not going to lie. I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument to make because, you tell me if I'm wrong. I actually thought that, while I figured space and cyber would ultimately become their own services and have their own combatant commands, which, space has done both. Cyber, not necessarily yet, but I would submit that you have to have a kinetic ability to engage in warfare and to have exchange on the battlefield. Now, if your function is purely support, then you don't have that. The Air Force didn't become the Air Force until it could bomb people. When it was balloons and when it was, observation, it wasn't the Air Force. It was when it could affect the battlefield that it became the Air Force. And so for space, I would submit that when it can affect the battlefield, and the battlefield very well can be space. I mean, we know we have kinetic kill vehicles and we can laze and we can do all these things to damage and destroy satellites. But if Space Command and Space Force are saying that's not what they're supposed to do, they're a support element, then to me it was somewhat a premature decision. But in reality, don't they really have the ability? It's really sort of a focus issue as opposed to a ability issue or capability issue.
Well, so I guess to answer that question, I need to probably back up a little bit. So part of the reason why there is a Space Command and a Space Force is some inside Pentagon White House baseball that we can get into.
Wait a second. Are you saying politics affected the creation of the Space Force?
Space Command. The Space Force was pretty bipartisan. And just because of Goldwater Nichols and the way our combatant commands, our military structure is organized, that you have services that organize, train, and equip forces specific for their operating domain areas. So Air Forces are air, Navy is sea, Army is land, that kind of thing. So Space Force was supposed to be focused on getting after the threat from China and Russia and others, and that has become growing humongously. And as a result, Space Force and Space Command came to be. The other reason why Space Force came to be from an organized, train, and equip standpoint is because the Congress did not believe that the Air Force was treating space seriously and they were treating Air Force Space Command as strictly just a support arm of the Air Force, similar to how the Army treated the air arm as a support function of the Army. And a lot of Air Force people that you would talk to back then, even some today, still hold on to the belief that that's not the case, that we were not holding back, that the Air Force was not holding back the space folks. But in reality, that it's always been part of the mission, and it's always been a supporting function, and that's how it always has been. You talk to a space power guy like myself or others in the service, and they would say, no, the reason why we haven't been able to build kinetic capabilities in the numbers that are necessary, or even the non-kinetic capabilities of the numbers that are necessary to address a threat in space, much less defending terrestrial interests from space threats, is because of policy constraints from the White House and Congress, and also just doctrinal opinions that have held sway over the last decade. Or several decades. So if you look at what was going on in the 60s through the 80s, you had a buildup of potential space weapon system capabilities, and then those programs would get canceled with changes in administration or changes in Congress leadership. And then after the Cold War ended, and I use air quotes, whenever the Cold War ended in the early 90s, because there was no real threat. The Russians didn't have the money. A lot of their special military capabilities for missile defense, interceptors, and anti-satellite weapons were pretty much unfunded, and they weren't able to keep their tanks rolling. It was seen by many people, including, I think there was a quote from General Richard Myers, who later became commander of the first incarnation of Space Command and later the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he said we had space superiority by default. And so because of that attitude, they didn't think they needed to do anything other than providing some support stuff. And so that's why most of the acquisition capabilities were more for longevity of systems and not for survivability. They really didn't need a whole lot of electromagnetic jamming systems. They didn't need, in their minds, because there wasn't a big threat. It was all small powers that we were dealing with at the time. And so they thought, what's the big deal? So let's save some money. Now that's not the case. Since '07, you've been seeing that huge increase in capability from the Chinese with their what they call a multi-layered attack architecture and their system destruction concepts. And yet the current administration still has a policy called the Space Priorities Framework that the Trump administration tried to get it going in the right direction, but they only had one term. And when the handover came, they developed this space priorities framework that viewed military space as an enable and support function again. And so we're back to where we were in the 90s and the
So
early 2000s.
what's the rationale behind space as a support function without this desire to build it into a a kinetic enabler, particularly when your adversaries are doing it, and you clearly know. The Chinese, what was 2007 when the Chinese created a huge debris field in space, and they've done it. The Russians have done it. We know they could do it, but why do we say, oh, no, 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 we're not going to go that route, and we don't want to? What's the rationale?
Well, the current policy rationale is that it's still sort of the take the high ground approach and work toward arms control, and such as the kinetic anti-satellite testing ban that the State Department and DoD are pushing in UN and other forums. You've got the norms push of responsible behavior in UN and other forums, and then you have just the viewpoint of the current policy that there really is no need to do the so-called space for space sake, which is one of my least favorite phrases because it always annoys me. And that basically, our terrestrial and our economic infrastructure, our force projection ability and everything is a force multiplier through space, and that's what space has been used as, and that's what it's good at, and therefore we should keep it there. Let's not rock the boat by provoking people in other countries into building up more space weapons, which, as you said, they're already doing. And so, but that's their rationale, is that if you serve as the model, others will follow, and that you can hold them accountable through international pressure. and or the threat from other domains such as or time, place, and domain of our choosing, as they say, which I also don't buy, and I know the adversary doesn't buy, is that because there's no historical precedent of the United States responding to jamming, lasing, or any of that stuff in kind or in other domains. We have never, we've been late, like there's been NRO directors and others who have gone before Congress and said, we've been lased numerous times. You have General Thompson, the vice chief of space operations, saying frequently that and I think it was a Space News article a few months ago, we are attacked daily from a reversible standpoint from jamming and lasing and things of that sort. And you can even read this on the commercial sector is also having issues with this, as the International Telecommunications Union publishes jamming reports. Some of them are accidental. Some of them are just, it's a bunch of frequency jamming issues just because people cross paths accidentally. But there are a lot of actual attacks going on. And so while the kinetic strikes piece hasn't necessarily happened a whole lot, there are other issues that we may have talked about before, and so it's not just to space and in space, but it's from space, like the fraction orbital bombardment system that China demonstrated a year or so ago with a hypersonic glide vehicle on top. The fact that those can penetrate gaps in sensing capability and take out vital targets, ground radars, things of that sort is a big deal, and yet somehow we think just by trying to treat space as a sanctuary and as if somehow it's a different place than air, land, and sea has been in history is odd, but it is where the policy rationale is coming from.
So is it? I sort of wonder. You always reason by analogy. It's a common thing. So I sort of wonder, back to the early days of the United States when we granted, because we didn't have the capability, so we granted letters of marque and reprisal. So do we need a system of, marque and reprisal in space if you know Space Command says we're not going to protect, the commercial sector, and we don't really do a good job of protecting our own? How about Congress granting the commercial sector letters of marque and reprisal so that they can?
Well, yeah. So I have two thoughts on that. The first part is I have argued that one way to help the Space Force and the DoD as a whole can focus their efforts and their limited resources on what's important is to protect critical space infrastructure. And that's one good thing in the current Biden policy document that I referenced, is that it mentions that space systems should be viewed as critical infrastructure, both from an economic and a military standpoint. But if you don't have the ability to protect it, you can't really guarantee that support will happen. On your other question to the marque and reprisal, what's interesting is that a lot of the same folks who published the policy for this administration also worked in the Obama years. And I remember there was a lot of concern about private military companies being hired to protect, whatever it is, either on land or sea. And there's lots of books written against it, reports from various think tanks against private military companies to be able to defend commercial assets, but they have to defend themselves against piracy or Iranian Navy ships trying to seize or damage, and they're like firing upon these vessels. And so I find it interesting that I think that would be what you'd have to do if the military is not going to be resourced to handle it. We had that situation back before our Navy became big enough to do what it's doing, like you mentioned. So like back there was an incident, I think in the late 1800s. After the Civil War, our Navy had downsized to the point where it couldn't do much, and it was called the Virginius, I believe, was the ship, and it was a ship that was moving equipment and support as a privateer for Cuban rebels against the Spanish. It wasn't an official U.S. vessel, but it flew under the U.S. flag, and the Spanish Navy decided they were going to intercept it, imprison guys, and start executing people. And because we didn't have the ability to respond, we didn't have the technology or the weapon systems capable, we relied on our friendship with the British Royal Navy to go in and take care of business. Well, those folks didn't have their own defenses, and there might even be laws that people want to pass to prevent them from doing that. But because of the connection between our daily life and the commercial sector's items in space, whether it's broadband communications or the banking industry or transportation or energy, everything would grind to a halt if a lot of the system destruction concepts and things the Chinese are preparing for actually happen. So I think it's an idea. I can't see the current people in the administration being supportive of that, and I can see probably a feisty debate in Congress between the two sides on that too. But ideally, Space Force should be given its resources, and the Space Command should have its priorities in order. And it's not support first, protect second. It's protect first. Otherwise, you won't have the equipment in orbit to support with.
And then that goes back to this broader notion of deterrence. It's sort of hard to deter if you have no capability. It's capability times will, and it seems like we're showing neither capability nor will, which when you put that equal sign and the deterrence out to the side, that zero capability times zero will is going to equal zero deterrence. I think my
Yeah,
math is right on that one. So
yeah. Well, if you look at the current folks working space policy in the DoD and the NSC for the Biden administration, you've got a lot of people who were recycled from the Obama years. And during the Obama years, their national security space strategy tried to redefine deterrence to include norms, alliances, things of that sort. And then of course response was not respond in space, but from other things. And then you have now that kind of viewpoint playing out in the norms and the test ban and the arms control push. But at the same time, you also have the White House. I'm assuming it's the White House pushing the Space Force to redefine space superiority to focus on supporting the joint force and not what space superiority has always meant, which is the ability to, you know, protect all sectors, commercial, military, civil, interest in space by force and the use of
right.
force. And that force can be non-kinetic, but it also, you need to have some sort of threat in the mind of the adversary, and threatening them with, a vote at the UN or a demarche is not exactly credible given the behavior of such activities from the Chinese.
And you have to be able to deny your adversary the use of that space, like sea control or air superiority. You own it and you control it, and they don't and they can't. That's sort of the basis of it. So it's not just that we can communicate better than you can. That sort of doesn't really work. I mean, that's not superiority.
Right.
Well, I also wonder, like, if I'm a commercial, space company, and my government has said we're not going to do anything for you, you're on your own. How does that impact what I'm willing to do, what I'm willing to spend money on? Um, you know, because I can only imagine it would hamper what the commercial sector, what risk the commercial sector would take. Like, will I build the same sort of really nice capabilities, knowing that I'm going to get no support from my government if the Chinese or the Russians come after it? Will I build less capability, less, in less investment, less technology? Does that hamper me, or do I just build whatever I want to build anyways, and I don't worry about that, and I just take the risk?
Yeah, well, the thing to think about first off is that up until this point, the commercial sector has been very involved with the combatant commands and the services regarding space-related items and terrestrial support. Commercial folks are sitting on the floor at the commercial space ops, or the combined space ops center out in California. They've got information sharing agreements to help them with spaceflight safety and all that. And like I said, they also have contracts where they're providing services to the Department of Defense. So with all that, um, there's always been sort of this tacit understanding that if the crap hits the fan, that we're going to have some sort of partnership to help defend things, whether it's through launch indemnification or policy coverage or whatever. And we've been working that way toward helping figure out how we defend the commercial sector and all that, because there are other people who have argued that, well, commercial sector is not a military target. Well, if you read Chinese writings that are legit writings, anything that's used for the military is a legit military target. Same with the Russians. So I don't know what is going on in the minds of the commercial sector after that quote. Some might just assume that it was taken out of context, but for those that have read the Unified Command Plan change, it doesn't specifically spell out that. However, one thing that I've mentioned on a LinkedIn post was that in the military, whenever you're a commander, you're given specified tasks. And so the UCP has specified tasks, what things he's responsible for as a combatant command. But there is also something called implied tasks that you may not have in writing, but it's implied because of your specified tasks. And all of those together become your essential tasks as a command. And so to me, regardless of the fact that there's nothing in writing that says thou shalt protect commercial industries space capabilities that you happen to be using and paying for, it's an implied task that it's your job to defend and protect U.S. flagged space vehicles wherever they are, 100 kilometers and up, because that's your area of responsibility. So why is it not your responsibility? If it's, imagine the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command saying to a commercial freighter going through the Straits of Malacca, "Sorry, if the Chinese start to try to hijack your vessel and open fire on you, that you're on your own. We'll send a nice note to them saying how bad they are, but and in the case of the one I used of the Iranian Strait of the Gulf of Oman, that was an Iranian Navy vessels opening fire on. They weren't U.S. vessels, but they were Allied vessels. There was a Bahamian, I think, one, and then I forgot the other country. But either way, that's what we're here for. And then the other question is that people have raised to me is like, well, we can't be everywhere in space because space is big and we don't have enough stuff. Like, well, I know you made my point. We don't have enough things, but the Navy doesn't have thousands and thousands of ships either. The Navy's like 300 and some ships currently, and yet there are like hundreds of thousands of vessels traversing the world's oceans on a day-to-day basis. The point is a matter of presence and having enough capabilities spread out to render assistance when necessary. And the fact that we're still, building our architectures, even with the multiple numerous satellite options, sort of in an old school way, it's not really as helpful. And so I would think that if you're a commercial guy wanting to invest in military capabilities, you just either bite your lip and take it and hope for good insurance coverage, or try to look for other business. But for now, because it's such a lucrative market, I don't see them pulling out of the market.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull out my genie. His name's Bob. And I'm going to rub my magic lamp. Poof, Bob is out. Bob gives you 3 wishes for the future of space. No, what is number 1?
My first wish would be that the Space Force is able to posture appropriately, have the budget, resources, and personnel it needs to project force, not just non-kinetic, but kinetic force in from into space. That's number 1.
Okay, good one. Number 2.
Number 2, it would be my preference that U.S. Space Command is restructured to fit its area of responsibility, and all of its terrestrial focus components, such as an air, land, and sea component, would be deactivated, and rather it would become a specified combatant command with Space Force providing the majority of the capability, and its subcomponents focused on key regions of space that require special attention, such as low Earth orbit, geo, medium Earth orbit where the GPS constellations are, and cislunar.
Okay. Number 3.
Number 3, that we would develop space-to-ground weapon systems that would help us deal with the anti-access area denial issues that the Air Force and Navy are focusing in the Pacific and other places, because we are really short of airplanes and really short of ships. And so in a war of attrition, it would be better to come through areas that they have no defenses, and that's from orbit.
That's really cool. Those are called rods from God.
And the Chinese have already demonstrated that they have the ability to do that. Nuclear or conventional, and hypersonic.
All right. Chris Stone, that was the final word.
All right.
Thanks for joining us. It was informative. You said a lot of things I didn't know. So, I mean, I learned something. I'm confident the listeners will have learned something as well. So thanks for coming.
No problem. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us. And we'll see you on the next episode of NucleCast. I always enjoy Chris Stone's thinking because he's a really good, clear thinker, especially about space. And I find myself almost always in violent agreement with Chris. And I found myself there today, and his arguments are pretty compelling as you think about space and who's going to defend it. And then if Space Command or the Space Force says, well, it's not ours because it's commercial. And then you compare that to, what the Navy does. It's a logical argument. And so I found myself, sort of nodding and saying, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And so it's one of those things that hopefully you, the listeners, will think your way through.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Crumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.